Guys, this is Chris. Welcome to Badaboom. I have a very special guest. Everyone's been loving The Last of Us. It's gotten universal praise, almost as much praise as the video game. So I thought it was appropriate to bring the biggest hater I know onto the show to talk about the series and talk about the new episode. And that is my friend Mike. What's up, Mike?
Great. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, thank you. I'm excited to talk to you about this because you just about hate everything. So, and I haven't played the game the way you have. I played the first like hour to get that emotional scene out the way. But any game that has stealth, I turn into Derek Zoolander where he can't turn left. I just can't. Like there's something, there's a piece of my brain that's missing that can't play stealth games. Even stealth parts of the game. So that's not a stealth game, but so I thought it'd be great to have you on and to talk about it. And it was a great episode that just happened. I liked it. So what did you think of episode 3 and what do you think of the series so far?
So when you kind of texted me and said, "Hey, do you want to talk about, the Last of Us show?" I said, "No." And you were kind of surprised by that. And my general kind of attitude towards the show since it was announced was a bit of like ambivalence because I feel like the game stands on its own. Like it doesn't need that kind of component of it. And the more I started hearing about the show, the less interested in it I was. When the game first came out in 2013, I was a very big fan of it, and those were kind of my formative years, and in terms of my creativity. And the game taught me a lot about character development and the value of ambiguity and things like that. And those themes have stuck with me for a while. And I don't think they've stuck with the creator of the series, Neil Druckmann. And when I found out that he was involved with the show, that kind of really dampened my enthusiasm for it because I feel like he's kind of lost sight of his own creation, which tends to happen when everyone around you just calls you a genius and nobody ever calls you out on maybe when you're doing something wrong. So I think that's a little bit evident in the work that he's done since then. But as I started to watch the show, I kind of realized that my opinion hadn't really changed. I'm still kind of ambivalent towards it. And the real biggest reason for that is the length. This
Yeah.
is a 9 episode show, and we have so far had 2 episodes that were an hour and 20 minutes, and 1 episode that was, I think, roughly 50 minutes. So these are almost feature length movies, especially the first and the third episode.
No, it's pretty nuts too, because we both just finished watching the third
Yes.
episode, and you had texted me. You're like, "Fuck, this is long,"
Oh yeah.
and
Yeah.
I'm still watching it too. I was like, "Oh, like I was doing a little chores. I was like, I'll wash some dishes. I'll put it on right when it's like it hits HBO Max at 9:50. It'll be done." And I'm like, I'm watching the episode, and it's a great episode to me, and I'm like, am I gonna be able to record this episode tonight? Like,
Yeah.
am I like? And the funny thing is, the other night I watched a really long film, and it didn't even feel as long as this has. Like, I watched Elvis the other night, and that felt like it was 90 minutes. Compared to this, which was 120. Like, how long this was? Like an hour and 20 and
Hour
something.
20 minutes. Hour and
Yeah,
20 minutes.
that
Almost
that
feature length.
yeah, that 3 hour movie felt shorter than this. But yeah, I definitely feel you on that. And I think this is a great time to have you on too, because based on me watching Let's Plays and the behind the scenes, this is an episode that deviates very far from the game in terms of the characters that were introduced. So what do you think about those changes? And do you feel that those changes enhance the story of Bill and Frank? And for me, I think it definitely lays out what's to come. It's definitely telegraphing the what Joel's going to go through. But I'm interested to hear what you think, especially being that you loved that game when it came out. Um, and it had such a big impact on you in terms of like the way you see storytelling.
Sure. Well, again, this is the consequence of having it be 9 episodes. when you think about the game, and I actually looked into this, I did a little bit of like looking at some YouTube videos that have just the cinematics of the game, like no gameplay. And if you look at the game, if you just play it through just by yourself with gameplay, it's about 9 to 10 hours. But just the cinematics and just the straight up story elements are about 3 hours. So if like when I was thinking about it, when I beat the game all those years ago, 10 years ago, and I was like, yeah, this could be a movie. If you really think about it, 3 hours, you take out all the little superfluous elements, cut that down to 2 hours and 30 minutes, you got your feature right there. 2 hours and 30 minutes for a story like this is like perfect, because it's a bit of an epic with the whole cross country journey and all that. So I felt like that would have been the sweet spot. But instead, they went for 9 episodes, and given how long these episodes are, we might be even looking at 10 hours. So we're stretching arguably 3 hours of story into 10 hours of story. So we're almost tripling the amount of content that the creators have to actually put into the show versus what was in the game originally. And that's why you have this episode, because this episode completely deviates from the game. Bill in the game was just a side character. You interact with him for maybe 10 to 15 minutes, and his story is fine. He's just like a very mean, kind of grumpy old man who's a curmudgeon type guy who just hates everyone. And when Joel and Ellie come through, he just kind of helps them out of spite, and then he sends them on their way. And in this episode, he kind of comes. They change his character. He's much nicer, which is basically what they've done with every character in the story. Everyone's a lot nicer, and I've noticed that, and it seems to be a lot more hopeful than the game was. Because in the beginning, Joel and Tess and everyone, and even Ellie to a certain extent, they're much meaner, they're much angrier, and this show has a much more hopeful tone to it, and that's really apparent with this particular episode because it completely changes the story from the game. This is not what happens in the game, and if you look at it from not ever playing the game perspective, it's a good story. It's a good story. It's very heartfelt. It's very emotional. But then when you look at it from the perspective of someone who's played the game, it's also interesting because they're changing it up enough so it doesn't feel like you're just, watching a shot for shot remake of the game, which the previous two episodes in certain points felt like that, where it just felt like, okay, well, let's just remake the game live action. And I'm firmly in the camp of, if you are going to remake something or bring it to the big screen, whatever the adaptation process is, it should be different from the source material. If I wanted to just experience the same thing over again, I would just play the game again. I need something different when I'm watching an adaptation. I know the Death Note adaptation gets a lot of hate from people, but I enjoy it precisely because it's not like the anime. If I wanted to watch the anime,
Listen,
I would just
listen,
watch the
listen.
anime again.
I want this show, this podcast to last, so I can't have you saying positive
Listen, you
things
listen. You
about the
introduced
Death
me as
Note.
the biggest hater, so
Uh,
I'm going to have to bring a little bit of hating on the show.
yeah, actually, no, yeah, I think that what's interesting too is, um, even as someone that kind of watched those Let's Plays and stuff like that, like a lot of it, and I think this is my issue with the show. I like it, I think it does some really interesting things, but it's not breaking new ground. The game did all of this, but it definitely telegraphs all of these key moments that were in the game. At the end of this episode, you get the car, and then you're like, all right, I know where that car is gonna go. And then in this, like, yes, it's very different, that story of Bill and Frank, and it's a story in itself. Well, if you have an hour and a half to do it, you better tell a story. But it definitely tells, like, hey, like, Bill and Joel are very alike. And that essential suicide note was telling him, hey, you have something to fight for, have something to live for. You protect that. And you see how touched Joel is. But for me, I think that's kind of like where I'm like, hey, like, are people who played the game really loving this? Because it just seems like it's just telling you, like, hey, we're gonna play the hits in a little, like, just wait. And I think another issue, now that you've gotten me back on the hate side, is that this game has not is not one of those things that stood stuck in time. It's not like it came out in 2013 and then, the sequel came out and we this has been re-released at least 6 times. So so it's not like, hey, like you experienced it in 2013, you gave yourself a little breather and now you're re-experiencing it. We've seen this 3 4 times. And even me, where I watched the first episode, I was like, man, I should really like, overcome my thing against stealth games. I was like, let me play the game. And I was like, I bought it, but I could have sworn they re-released it and there's a better version. And I go into the PS store and it was like $70. I was like, fuck that. If the sequel's 40, I'm not paying 70 for the first game when I have it already. Yeah, I had it. And I had a remaster. I didn't have the remake, but I had the remaster. And I think that's something that's definitely holding it back. But it does. I think people experiencing it for the first time, it's really emotional. But in terms of like zombie shows, I don't think it gets really better than the first season of The Walking Dead, which was 6 episodes and did not waste a minute of what was on the screen. And you're right, where these episodes have gone on a little long, and HBO does have a tendency when they get like an auteur type to give them like whatever they want. Um, I think with the later seasons of True Detective, you're like, is anyone giving these people notes? Like, like is anyone seeing these? And it's not that bad. But it definitely is like, hey, like there should be an editor here. There should be like not everything should be on the screen. And I felt that a little bit with this episode where I was like, hey, is Joel and Ellie ever gonna get to this place? I'm like, I think they dragging this so that this is a whole episode and they never get there. So yeah, I as someone that liked it, I definitely see the flaws in it.
Well, ultimately, the entire point of the game is the relationship between Joel and Ellie. That's the core of the experience. That's the meat and the potatoes. And when you're watching this, they're almost like the side characters at certain points, especially in this episode. And also, I also noticed with the openings of episode 1 and 2, where they kind of where they it's incredibly heavy-handed, where they just literally explain to you exactly what's going to happen and how the infection works. And I thought, well, this is superfluous because that's not what the game or the show is even about. The story here is the relationship between Joel and Ellie. Like, why are we even focusing on the transmission vector? I mean, ultimately, it could be anything. These could just be regular zombies, and it wouldn't really matter because the experience at the core of it is Joel and Ellie. And I worry going forward that all of the side characters that were in the game are going to get their own episodes, and that's going to take away from the heart of the story, which is the relationship between Joel and Ellie. And just in general, I feel like the kind of the that apart from the core experience, everything that's kind of surrounding it has been done so many times. Like when I was watching the first episode, like the whole day of the outbreak sequence may have been novel in 2004, when Zack Snyder did it in Dawn of the Dead, and then everyone started copying him. And it was already pretty hack by the time the game did it in 2013, because we had already seen that sequence so many times. But the reason it worked in the game is because it was, well, first of all, it was an interactive experience. You're controlling the camera, you're like very into it. It's got these AAA production values, and you've got that super heavy emotional climax, where Joel loses his daughter. But now watching it in 2023, it just felt so cliche. I've seen
Yeah.
the reason I feel like I've seen that sequence a million times is because we have seen it a million times. And what was particularly kind of like funny to me about this one is it had every stereotype of that opening sequence. Like you hear the radio and there's like a radio report of people getting violent. I feel like they almost had a checklist and they just said, okay, that's the stereotype. Oh, she's in the city and their ambulance is going by in the background. Check. Oh, there's a helicopter flying overhead. Check. And it's every single little thing gets checked off of that checklist. So, I mean, I understand why they had to do it because that's the story. but it's one of those things where maybe it would have been better to kind of like drip feed it throughout the series, if you know what I mean, to kind
Yeah.
of like not just immediately explain why Joel is the way he is, you know, maybe hold that off a little bit longer, hold that mystery off a little bit.
Yeah. They didn't hold off a lot in the second game, but
No, no,
to
they did not.
yeah, I feel that, but I do like that first episode. It does the thing that the Doom movie does, where it goes into that first person view where it's trying to be the video game, and I think it does it in a successful way where you're like, you get them in the car, you get them passing the burning building. You even get that little piece where Tommy and Joel and his daughter are separated. You're like, this is a video game, right? He could clearly like probably climb over that truck, but he's like, oh my god, the path is blocked. So there's I thought it was cool the way they approached that, but I see where you're coming from, where you know when when this came out, it was 10 years ago still, and when it came out, I think we had gotten to the point where you know um everyone was copying The Walking Dead, and the genre kind of had like died. With horror subgenres, whether it be monsters, zombies, they have their moment, they disappear, then they come back. So I think that definitely came back, and the problem with this, I think that might be sort of coloring your opinion, is that like we've been living this for the last 3 years, and about just every hack has come up with their own way of doing the pandemic, instead of putting in the work like Steven Soderbergh did with Contagion. Everyone's like, hey, I've lived Contagion, so I can create a post-apocalyptic story and stuff. And it does feel like, hey, a little bit tired, but I don't know. I've been liking it, and because I didn't play the game, I just watched it. I'm having a good experience, but I do feel like it's like one of those things where you're like, do people really like it this much? Because it's like it literally is the same thing. So it's like it'd be like watching the Watchmen movie and being like, oh my god, this is groundbreaking. It's like, no, the graphic novel broke the ground.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, I understand what you're saying, and I mean, just to get into like a couple of little like specific things, like especially in that opening sequence, I think one of the best parts of the game and the series so far is that moment when Joel and Tommy and Sarah are in the car and they're driving down the road and they see that family, and the family's like, please stop, please help us. And Joel goes, "Don't stop, keep going."
Yeah,
And then he kind of looks over to Sarah and he's like, "Don't worry, someone will come by for them." He was kind
yeah,
of placating her. And I love that moment because it tells you so much about the character. It's in 5 seconds, you learn more about that character than you do in like the last 25 minutes of that sequence. And it's such a perfect little moment. I'm so glad they included it in the shows because it really tells you a lot about Joel as a character. And I really like things like that where you don't have to explain to us that Joel is kind of like a pragmatist and he's just, he's a survivor, right? He just the actions tells us everything you need to know about the character in that specific case. And in terms of the just the writing in general, it's okay for the most part, but I'm not sure if it's clever or stupid. And the specific example of that is when Marlene walks into that little Firefly command center, and she goes in there, and one of the her little her the soldiers kind of questions her. She's like, "Why are we doing this?" And she kind of turns around at her and she goes, "You're here to follow fucking orders, so you better do what the fuck I say." And then the very next line out of her mouth is that the Fireflies are fighting against a military dictatorship and they're fighting for freedom. And I'm like, okay, so are they is that intentional? Did the writers know that what she just said was very hypocritical and they kind of understand that the Fireflies are kind of hypocrites, like they kind of were in the games? Or is that just bad writing? And I can't really tell because it's not exactly like clear because the rest of the show is like very serious. It's not very like tongue in cheek. But that moment was just kind of weird. So I don't know how I should feel about that. And then as for my kind of least favorite moment of the series so far is the museum sequence. And the specific reason for that is because it starts off so promising. You know, they're kind of like they're in that museum, it's very dark, it's very tense. And the clickers, when they show up, they're like very out of focus. They're shrouded in darkness, they're in the background, they're behind that glass, and you don't really see them. And I'm like, oh, this is great, right? Like this is they're playing it perfectly, and then they just shine a bright light directly into its face. It starts screaming, then it starts getting loud and noisy, and the CGI doesn't look very good. And I was just like, oh no, the cardinal rule of horror is that you don't show the monster immediately. You kind of hold off. And it's funny you mentioned that you're not very good at stealth sequences because the characters in the story aren't very good at stealth sequences either. Because apparently, Joel and Tess have been dealing with these things for years now, and then they just immediately get into a fight with them. And I understand that it's for the show, you got to have an action beat, but it would have been so much better if they had just kept them off camera for a little bit longer. Save them till like episode 4. That show us their true form then. You know. But what about you? What did you? Were there any specific moments that you liked or hated? What about you?
I really like this whole episode. I think the Bill and Frank thing was interesting. Especially being that you're able to see a story from beginning to end, and like I said earlier, with an hour and a half you can do that. uh, and it was an interesting character. Years ago, almost like 12 years ago, I think at this point, we met Nick Offerman. So he very much plays a version of himself, which is a survivor, someone that's very self-sufficient. And I thought it was interesting. It was a little like Bert and Ernie story that was um, really heartfelt. And I think again, it mirrors that journey you know that Joel's going to go on, where you have someone that's pragmatic and um, has to find a reason to live. They're surviving, but what are they surviving for? um and for someone that knows the way the game ends, I think that's a good way to kind of like foreshadow it and telegraph it. And for people that have never played the game, it's a very emotional story that yes, it deviates, and it really doesn't have the main characters in it almost at all. You have something that stands on its own. It's one of those episodes that I find that maybe people are going to look back on at the end of the season and be like, that's my favorite. It's always those little detour episodes that do it. Um and again, like for me, I didn't play the game, so I'm not that like invested either way, whether it's terrible or really good. And I am interested to see like where it goes, because I know where the fan reaction was. So I'm like, are people willing to forgive that when they have to eventually go to season 2? But I think it's trying to find a balance is tough, because on one hand, the reason you adapt these things is that it has a blueprint. There's a built-in fan base. Like, why should you change it? And then on the other hand, it's like, hey, this is a different form of storytelling. There are things that you need to do to make this compelling and worth watching, versus like going on YouTube and watching let's plays. So I've been enjoying it. I know people that haven't played the game, really love it, and there's been people who love the game who like are loving it. And I guess in some ways Druckmann was right, because I'm starting to see people sort of shine a pretty good light on Last of Us too. So I'm like, all right, we've gotten to that part in the cycle. But I've been liking the show. I think it's one of those things that I can bring people into, and that's the point of adaptations, is to reach a much broader audience. Not that there's much people that didn't play the game, because they've re-released it at least 6 times, and it's sold like a bajillion copies, and has been on PlayStation Plus and all these things. But I think any like adaptation should be able to bring more people in, and I've heard that. I've had conversations with people, and where it's someone like me who played the first 15 minutes was like, I suck. To feel like the expert on it on in a lot of conversations is interesting, because I'm like, I thought all of us played it or heard of it.
Yeah, and as like I said before, I'm firmly in the camp of people who believe that when you do an adaptation, it should be different from the game. So if anything, for me, it's like too much like the game. I mean, like I wanted it to be even more different, and I think the reason that it is the way it is because you have the creator of the franchise basically running the project. And I know there was like a little bit of production trouble because originally it was supposed to be Craig Mazin and Johan Renck who did Chernobyl, and it was just that. You know, they did that entire 5 episode run, and Johan Renck dropped out because of a quote unquote scheduling conflict, and then they replaced him with a director called Kantemir Balagov, and he actually directed the original pilot. I don't know if you knew that there was an original pilot of this show, which they scrapped and then filmed the one that we actually got. That was episode one. And Balagov, that director, dropped out because of creative differences. So I think one of the issues of having the creator have so much control over the adaptation is that it resembles the original product a bit too much. And I think the the better way forward would have been to have Druckmann as just like a producer instead of an executive producer and a writer, and just have him be able to just kind of make, minor decisions instead of just, I mean, he directed the second episode. So
Yeah.
he has like a lot of creative control over the product. And I think with adaptations, there should be a degree of separation between, like, I don't think Alan Moore should have directed Watchmen, right?
Yeah.
There's a good reason for that. I think when you create something, sometimes you get a little too wrapped up in it, and it's better to just have a fresh set of eyes that can really take the essence of the experience while not really worrying so much about the details, because this show is strangely detail oriented. Like, as I mentioned, that both episode 1 and 2 have those intros where they're like explaining the virus and showing you exactly how it works, and I'm just like, well, why is that even in there? Like, does it really need, do we really need to know these things, right?
Yeah.
Like, shouldn't we be more focused on the story of Joel and Ellie, because that's the core of the
Well, you
experience.
got an hour and a half to fill, man. You got to put
Exactly. But that's
something.
but that's exactly what I was going to
Yeah.
say, is that what you're doing is, you have 15 more scenes to film. And look, I understand the realities of production, and as far as the people who are making the show, they want the show to go on forever. Like, they would have, the people making the show, they want it to be 14 episodes. And I think one of my favorite examples of a show going wrong because of that is Legion season 2. And I'm sure I think you've seen that. And
Yeah.
that was an example of where the season was originally supposed to be 8 episodes, and they stretched it out to 11, and it turned out really bad. And if you think about it, this series is like, I'm not going to say like the amount of work they have to do is even more than that, because instead of turning 8 episodes into 11, they have to turn effectively 3 episodes into 9. So they have to triple the amount of stories. So going forward, we're definitely going to see a lot more side character stories like the one that we saw today. And I was actually curious because the first 2 episodes are just pretty much following the events of the game very closely. And so I was kind of curious because even though they kind of double the time, so for example, the day of sequence in the game is about 14 minutes, and then in the show it's 30 minutes, so about double. And then the first episode is an hour and 20 minutes. And at that same point where it leaves off in the game, you're about 40 minutes into the story in the game. So again, double. And I was wondering, like, well, that means that there should be, like 6 episodes, not 9. And now seeing this episode, I said, oh, okay, that's how they're gonna stretch this out. They're gonna
That's how we
tell the
got
stories.
here.
They're gonna take the side characters and they're really gonna flesh them out. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I mean, I like this episode. I think it was good, but overall, as someone who is kind of focused on the core of the experience, I'm worried about where they're going to take it next, and if they're going to focus too much on the side stuff and not enough on the, on the story of Joel and Ellie. But overall, I think it's the show is perfectly fine. And if you haven't played the game, then yeah, I recommend it. The thing that I think that really is the best part about it is how much happens in it.
Yeah.
In the first 3 episodes of this show are like, it would take 3 seasons of The Walking Dead to do the same amount of stuff. Like, it has movement, it has momentum.
Yeah.
And so even if you're not a fan of post-apocalyptic stuff or anything like that, I would recommend it. And even if you watched, if you played the game and you're like kind of ambivalent towards it, I would say still, give it a watch, because you might just enjoy it. And I don't really think there's anything particularly wrong with it so far. So, even though you called me the biggest hater ever, I'm pretty, like I said, I'm pretty ambivalent towards it, and there's nothing wrong with it.
Listen, man, if you don't call this the greatest show ever made, I think
I
these days
know,
you're pretty much called a hater. So
I
I
know,
think in this case I'm also called a hater. But I'm glad you brought up Legion, because I think and connecting it to the creator being very involved, I think the trap with some of this is really getting, you know, in your own head and feeling like you're a genius. I think Legion, the issue was, it wasn't the length of the second season. It was the fact that they had fallen in love with the trippiness. They had fallen in love and sort of, and not focused on what the core of it. And I think that's what you're talking about. Like, hey, like, this is good, but the further we deviate from that core relationship of Joel and Ellie, that's where you can go down a path where you may not be able to stick this landing. And if it's universally praised and revered, we might get to a point where, hey, somehow season 2 is gonna cause a worse reaction than the game did. The Last of Us Part 2, which I don't think is possible. So uh, but you never know. We've lived through a global pandemic, and they've released this game like 20 times. So I think anytime anything is possible in this world. But I'm glad to get your opinion, because I value it. I think sometimes I get in my own head, and like, even as we were talking, I was like, yeah, shit, like, I guess you're right, because I was in the mood where I'm like, also I'm a Pedro Pascal fan, so I'm like, I'm ready to, like, get my pom poms out for the show, and kind of like to argue with you. But like, you brought up some points, and I was like, yeah, I guess that is. But I guess that is like what hate is. You get a little mob together, you hear someone yelling on the street, and you're like, yeah, yeah. Let me throw this trash can through that window. So, but yeah, I'm glad you share that, because you really articulated sort of where you're at with it. And I think the show has done well, and it's given people a lot to chew on. It's given people a lot to talk about, like we've been talking about, like, I'm sure like IGN, it's like looking over things like, oh my God, this whole episode deviates from the game. Let me make like 20 listicles of how it's different so far. And it was funny, I already saw like their 10 out of 10 review for this episode. I'm like, oh, par for the course. But yeah, man, thank you for coming on. I definitely have to
Thank you
have
for
you
having
on
me.
again. It's sad I didn't get you on for the Black Adam episode, just
Oh.
because that would have been a hate fest.
I
You
think we
listen
should
to,
just I think we should just do another review
we
of it,
should
because
do
there's so much
re-review.
to talk about.
We
A
should do
re-review, yes.
re-review. We should do review.
Yes.
Even though we'd be, stealing an idea from, the great Red Letter Media, but we both love that channel. But I think, you know, Troy and we're generally positive on things, and the fact that we hated that movie, it was pretty bad. So
Yeah.
I would be excited to this year. Let's set it out, guys. If you really like this episode and you really like Mike's hateful thoughts, let's the first movie that's like really bad that we could all agree on that is bad. And if I like really hate it, I'm gonna have Mike on and we're gonna have a hate off. It's gonna be like the player hater ball, you know. We're gonna
We're
give
gonna be
out like
snapping our
it's gonna
fingers.
yeah, it's gonna be like the Razzies, but audio form. So if you'd like that like and subscribe, show all the love, share this episode. But yeah, thanks, Mike. It's been a pleasure. And with that, bada boom.
Bada boom.